think of ourselves as the most powerful beings in the universe, it's unsettling to discover that we're wrong. Time has come to see the world as it is.
Can we pull back the veil of static and reach into the source of all being? Behind this curtain lies this random pattern generator. You will be responsible for an escalation that will destroy everything.
This episode of Chaos Shamanism contains explicit sexual content. Listener discretion is advised. In this episode, I'll continue to read journal entries from the past. April 2nd, 2014. It's titled A Cosmic Schism in Prehistory. One of the very bizarre and unexpected things which my spirits have told me is that in the ancient past, the spirit world, or fairy world, or heaven, or whatever, was actually closer to or even intertwined with the physical world. The beings that now interact with mediums and shamans, zip by in UFOs, and abduct people in the night were actually living right alongside humans in prehistory in a form which could have been entirely physical. So, the fantasy worlds of fiction where elves, dwarves, trolls, and dragons live with humanity in the physical world may not be comprehensively fictional, but a memory metaphor of the ancient world. There would be no fossil remains or ruins of their civilizations because they and everything about them separated from physical reality a long, long time ago. This concept was entirely new to me when they told me about it, and it's not something I've told anyone else for fear of being laughed at. Though this morning I read this quote from renowned mythologist Mircea Eliade, taken from her book Myths, Dreams, and Mysteries. Quote, "Archaic myths worldwide speak of an extremely close proximity that existed primordially between heaven and earth. In illo tempore, the gods came down to earth and mingled with men, and men, for their part, could go up to heaven by climbing the mountain, tree, creeper, or ladder, or might even be taken up by birds." End quote. Professor John Mack elaborates, quote, "These ascension myths," Eliade says, "these images of the earth and the heavens being somehow joined are found in many tribes, including Australian, Pygmy, and Arctic, and have been elaborated by pastoral and sedentary cultures and transmitted right down the great urban cultures of Oriental antiquity. When heaven was abruptly separated from earth, when the tree of the liana connecting earth to heaven was cut, or the mountain which used to touch the sky was flattened out, then the paradisiac stage was over, and humans entered into their present condition. Only special members of every culture, like shamans, could continue to move between heaven and earth, between humans and the spirit world." End quote. This also makes me think of Adam and Eve being cast out of the garden and sent to toil in the fields from the Bible. Perhaps when my spirits insist that the Lord of the Rings is metaphorical prehistory, they are referring to a time when this link was present. Perhaps the defeat of Sauron, the exodus of the elves, the physical separation of the realm of the Valar, and the beginning of the Age of Men represent the severing of that connection. October 17th, 2014. I believe that I have already mentioned that since my interactions with spirits are mostly touch-based, clairsentience, I am able to interact physically with them. And since some of them are beautiful young women, we have sex. Sexuality is a very big thing in many spirit realms, though the lower realms are rather devoid of anything pleasurable. It's been going on for years now and has grown in intensity and power over time. Now, it isn't something where I merely feel an energy that gets me off, so to speak. I can specifically feel their tongues lick, fingers squeeze, breasts envelop me, vaginas clench down hard, and even their piercings stimulating me. Yes, spirits can have piercings and tattoos. They also really, really know what they're doing. One of the most amazing things is that I can often feel their orgasms. I felt my whole body shudder and shake like a woman coming as wave after wave of female orgasm surges through me. The male orgasms I've been used to are like a direct crescendo, like a rocket ship lifting off and exploding, but the female orgasms I've felt with them are more like incremental surges of pleasure that come in waves that make the whole body shudder. Something I haven't really considered is that I may be one of the few people in the world that can experience both male and female orgasms. Even after years of this, something happened recently which really surprised me. After one of them had gone down on me, I found distinct teeth marks on my penis. Each mark corresponding to where each unique tooth is, and the unmistakable arch-like arrangement of the teeth clearly visible. And no one physical had gone down on me anytime recently at that point, so it wasn't from that. October 25th, 2014. Recently, a good friend of mine began channeling beings who say that they are Arcturians. In talking to him/them, a lot of the same information I get from my contacts was communicated, generally about how the wall of materialistic belief reinforcement is coming down in our world. One of his beings contorted my body about and extracted something from me. Later on, I worked with him to extract something nasty from his body. I pulled the offending little bastard into my own body and coughed it out. He then banished it completely after we could both perceive it still sitting on the floor like an unwanted slug. Even though I have already received lots of evidence that what I'm experiencing is real and not just in my head, it's nice to find someone else who is experiencing something very similar. November 5th, 2014. Interesting little factoid. With my rather unwelcome ability to feel other people's energies and emotions, I've noticed that when someone is aroused, or horny, it feels pretty much exactly the same as when someone's angry. November 11th, 2014. I've invoked and have been hearing extremely bizarre whistling sounds in my apartment which I've never heard before, having lived here for years. Now, there is something absolutely massive stomping around on the roof of my building. Certainly not an animal, heavier than a man, walking methodically on two legs. And yeah, I live on the top floor, by the way. I don't know what it is, but my guide says that it isn't normal. November 18th, 2014. 2 recent incidents of possible micro-precognition. 1. I was looking at a link to an article online. When I clicked on it, the word privilege popped into my head very vividly. I then started thinking about an old sci-fi movie called Privilege. When the article loaded up, I saw that the word privilege was repeated over and over again in the article, at the beginning of every sentence, in fact. When I went back to the link, I saw that the word privilege was not in any part of the link at all. 2. Listening to a podcast, which I had never heard before, someone on it brought up a scenario involving a bunch of bugs living in their bed's headboard. I then thought to myself, fortunately, they're talented musicians and they play relaxing music every night to put you to sleep. Which, isn't exactly the first thing that comes to mind when you hear someone mention that they have bugs living in their headboard. Right after I thought that, someone else on the show said, fortunately, they are all beautiful singers, and they form a choir that lulls you to peaceful sleep every night. I don't know, they may be nothing, but they both strike me as very bizarre. And now, the news.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
The weather was clear and hot in April or May 1956, on the day when live fish fell from the sky on a farm at Chalachi near Uniontown, Alabama. The witness and her husband were surprised to see a small, very dark cloud forming in the sky. It was almost overhead when it started to rain, the rain falling in a very small area about 200 feet square, and as the rain fell, so the cloud turned from dark to almost white. During the 15-minute rain shower, 3 types of fish were seen to fall: catfish, bass, and bream, all local fish. They were alive and flopping about on the ground. When the rain stopped, the cloud dispersed. The witnesses could not account for the event. Since the fish were alive, they had clearly not been in the sky for long, but there was no unusual weather in the area and no whirlwinds or tornadoes were reported. Another story concerns 3 fishermen from a tiny Pacific island in the Kiribati group. In 1986, they survived 119 days adrift in an open boat after their engine broke down. They lived by catching and killing sharks, drinking their blood, and eating them raw. When they were finally rescued, they told how, one night, while they were praying for a different kind of fish as they were tired of eating raw shark, something fell into the boat. It was a rare, blackish fish which never comes to the surface, living over 600 feet deep in the ocean. In Indiana, on the 21st of May 1911, it was reported, during the hard rain here today, an alligator 2 feet long fell from the clouds and, landing on the step of the home of Mrs. Hiram Winchell, decided to crawl in at the front door. The visitor was killed by Mrs. Winchell and several other women with bed slats. Late in 1960, a 5-foot crocodile was found in a backyard at Long Beach, California, after the occupants heard a heavy thump and a loud grunt, and they assumed it had fallen from the sky since there seemed to be no other explanation. Equally mystifying was the discovery of a small dead monkey in a back garden at Broadmoor, California, early in the morning of 26 October 1956 by Mrs. Faye Swanson. The 4-by-4-inch post holding her clothesline had been splintered, presumably when struck by the falling creature. It was theorized that the monkey had fallen from a plane, but an airport spokesman said no planes had been carrying monkeys that night. Starfish, crabs, and clams, all saltwater species, have been recorded falling at inland locations. Starfish fell on St. Cloud, Minnesota on the 21st of April 1985, and they were identified as originating off Florida, a long way away. Crabs fell on Laidley in Queensland, Australia on the 12th of May 1930, a location 50 miles from the sea. And 1 clam fell in Yuma, Arizona on the 20th of August 1941, about 60 miles from saltwater. It was reported that on the 27th of August 1968, meat and blood fell over an area of 1 square kilometer for 5 to 7 minutes between Cocpava and São José dos Campos in Brazil. The meat, in chunks 2 to 8 inches long, was violet and spongy, and drops of blood also fell. No aircraft or birds were seen in the sky at the time. Indeed, the sky was clear. The origin of this meat was not immediately obvious, but in March 1986, a recognizable piece of flesh fell from the sky. A human finger. It landed with a thump on a car roof in West Berlin, Germany, as the owner was getting into the car. He thought it was a joke and left the finger by the roadside, but later that day he notified the police, who collected it and started looking for its owner. On the 12th of July 1961, at a house building site in Shreveport, Louisiana, the workmen could see that the peaches that fell from the sky were actually hard and green, the size of a golf ball, and were definitely falling from above and not being thrown. They also saw a thick cloud overhead, which is where the fruit presumably fell from, but the weathermen said that there had not been the right conditions that day for the fruit to have been lifted in strong winds. The other foodstuffs which have fallen this century have consisted of smaller items like the rice which fell on parts of Mandalay, Burma in January 1952, the seeds which fell on Savannah, Georgia in February 1958, the navy beans which fell in a hail shower on Van Nuys, California on the 6th of March 1958, the beans and peas which fell on Blackstone, Virginia in August 1962, and the beans which fell on a ranch at João Pessoa, Brazil in July 1971. The rancher boiled some of the beans, but said that they were too tough to eat. Also reports of hazelnuts falling in Bristol, Avon in March 1977, eggs falling on Wokingham, Berkshire in December 1974, mustard and cress seeds, maize, peas, and beans falling on Southampton, Hampshire in February 1979, and none of these falls can be easily accounted for. Now, this next event happened in early December 1974 in Frederick, Wisconsin by a William Bosak. The night was unusually mild for early December, so there were patches of fog on the road when this 69-year-old dairy farmer drove home from a co-op meeting at 10:30 p.m. Bosak was driving slowly with low-beam headlights when he noticed something in the westbound lane. Slowing almost to a stop, Bosak saw a disc-shaped object that was partly obscured by fog and either close to or resting on the ground. The object was about 6 feet across and shaped like a chemistry lab bell jar. Bosak's headlights were the only source of illumination. Inside the object's curved front of glass stood a strange figure with its arms over its head. Its eyes showed intense fright. The figure looked slender and was about 6 feet tall, covered with reddish-brown fur. Its head was slightly rectangular and its face was flat but hairless. The hair, or fur, which ran over and along the side of the head, appeared swept back. The creature's eyes were human-like, though they protruded slightly. Most peculiar, though, were the figure's calf-like ears, which were long and stuck out some 3 inches. As Bosak pulled up alongside the road and passed the object, his car lights dimmed and the object took off, making a swishing sound. The witness, fearing ridicule, waited more than a month before telling his story to a newspaper reporter. In Logan, New Mexico, a man claims he and his cousin were startled by a group of humanoids. Robert C., a resident of Logan, said they were fishing about 15 miles from their hometown when the alleged creatures began crossing the lake. Quote, "It was late in the evening and it was brewing up a rainstorm," he explains. "I was under a tree near the lake and I kept seeing something shiny across the lake." The man says that there were many of them and was able to give a physical description. "They were walking a path across from me. There were more there than I saw." Reportedly, as the short creatures approached, their shiny eyes were fixed on Robert and his cousin. Their eyes were big and round with an oriental slant to them. They were very skinny and had long arms and big heads. Not long heads, but large, he told MUFON about the decades-old encounter. Robert says they decided to run back to their truck, which was parked about half a mile from their fishing spot. "When we got there, we looked back and could see more of them, but we were too scared to look any longer." The man explains that they were not able to take photographs because they didn't have their phones with them. The 2 relatives decided to keep their sighting to themselves until now. "I don't think they are destructive to us, but they could be," said Robert. A group of people in Hobart, Indiana claim they came upon a humanoid creature. One of the residents, who chose to remain anonymous, says that he and a group of people were walking on a trail when the entity showed up about 10 days ago. Quote, "It crossed our path," he explains. "It turned and began a very distinct pig-like squealing. It looked perched up." The man reported on MUFON that the unknown creature started chasing them, prompting the group to run away. "We stopped halfway, and again it started squealing louder." The eyewitness described the entity as a grayish human-like creature that was walking on 4 legs. "It was very long and low to the ground, but it also perched up." The man says he is sure it wasn't a boar and that he had never seen anything like it. "I know many native and non-native animals, and this experience can't possibly be any I know," he said. In Amelia, Louisiana, a resident said on Friday that he had an encounter with an extraterrestrial creature. The anonymous man claimed he was driving to work on Highway 90 in Amelia when he came upon the alleged alien. Quote, "I exited off the highway and all of a sudden something ran in front of my car," he said. "I slammed on my brakes. When I came to a stop, there it was." The man says the encounter took about 3 seconds, but that he was able to take a very good look at it before it ran into the woods. "It was right in front of my car, about 1 foot from my hood. We both stared at each other." He described the creature as a skinny, pale-looking gray with a thin face and long, slanted eyes. "I scared the crappy out of it, and it scared me too," the Louisiana man claimed in his MUFON report. "I will never forget." On September 17, 1954, at 22:30 hours, in Senon, France, Vice David, 28, met a being in a diving suit who made friendly gestures. He was very small and had a voice inhuman and incomprehensible. The witness could not move throughout the encounter. He saw the creature enter an object on the road about 3 meters by 1 meter in size. It took off like lightning, throwing a greenish light. On September 18, 1954, at 20:15 hours, at Casablanca, Morocco, a small gray disc flew over a car at very high speed, followed by cold air currents. This was reported by Mr. Guita of Casablanca. On September 19, 1954, at 21:15 hours, at Oberdorf, France, a bright light was seen in the east, came to the ground, lost its brightness, remained on the spot about 40 seconds. It was the size of a small bus, and there was a figure in front of it. It rose and took on the appearance of a red ball. On September 20th, 1954, at 2300 hours, at the Santa Maria Airport in the Azores, a guard saw a craft 3.5 meters in diameter and 1 meters thick land on the airfield. The witness, Vittorino Lorenzo Montiero, said a figure emerged from the craft and said something he could not understand before taking off again. There were antenna-like protrusions on top of the object. On September 15th, 1954, at 23:20 hours, in Fézin, France, a white light suddenly swept the road in front of Roland M., 19, who observed that it came from a large dark object 10 meters above ground. It flew away with the noise of a wet firework, throwing magnesium-like sparks. On September 23rd, 1954, at 2100 hours, in Les Jours, France, the Patient family witnessed the landing of a bright object giving off a magnesium-like light, a red glow, and a narrow beam of light. It took off again a moment later and followed their car until they reached Fontland. Policemen and plombiers and several independent witnesses observed the object as it flew erratically over the area for 60 minutes. Now, some strange events from France. In Les Chaudes, farmer in field heard a bang, then felt sticky dust falling on him, which gave him secondary burns on his arms, hands, and face, and giddiness, sight problems, and anemia. 15th July 1966. In Les Brusques, fishermen saw UFO on the sea, with frogmen climbing aboard before it took off and was lost to view. 1st August 1962. At Mérignan Airport near Marseille, customs officers saw UFO come into land. 27th October 1952. In Mulhouse, wide range of poltergeist activity for over 4 years, with physical attacks, noises, an apparition, movement of objects, etc., 1978 to 81. In Neuville, poltergeist outbreak, June to July 1906. Off the Normandy coast, large black bird-like object fell into sea and disappeared, early July 1910. In Olsom, sightings of giant lizards several yards long, late 19th century and May 1939.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
That was a public service announcement designed to scare the shit out.
November 24th, 2014, titled Interesting Auditory Phenomenon. The other night, while microdosing and invoked, I went out on my balcony and heard a voice. It sounded like someone talking over a bullhorn or loudspeaker in a Texan accent, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. I was thinking that it was from some sports event, but then I realized that it was 1:30 a.m. No way in hell is there going to be a loud outdoor event at 1:30 a.m. in the city. It sounded like it was coming from about a mile away and was extremely loud wherever it was located. My guide told me that it was not a normal sound and that I could only hear it because I was microdosed and invoked. He said that it was basically something from another version of this city I live in that coexists in space-time with the physical city. I've heard many strange things like this while microdosed and invoked. I've heard a woman's voice outside, which I assumed was some public transportation rail system announcement, but then realized that it was too late for such a thing considering how loud and distant it sounded. I've heard horrible, guttural choking sounds coming out of my air vents like something from The Thing is living in my roof. Strange rushing vortex sounds, the aforementioned stomping on the roof, and howling, and also bizarre screeches outside. I also hear horrible screaming fights and intense sex sounds coming out of the walls and vents, and would have just written it off as hot-blooded neighbors, but my guide says that they aren't really there. He says that what I'm hearing in those instances is basically the same phenomenon that people experience with a lot of hauntings, specifically the ones called replays. These are events where high energy or emotional events in space-time can spill over in a way to other moments in time, yet in the same place. My guide says that it has to do with how time is more of an ocean than the straightforward river we usually imagine it to be. November 25th, 2014. Recently, at the end of a night microdosing and invoking, I looked outside to see a gray hawk, about 1.5 feet tall, perched on the roof of the apartment building opposite my own, just staring at me. This struck me as interesting because I've never seen a bird of prey like this in my immediate area, especially not chilling in my apartment parking lot in the city. And I've been told, and shown, several times that my spirit animal is a hawk. My guide confirmed that it was not a completely normal event, and that it did represent my spirit animal. So I blew it a kiss and went to bed. His undated entry is called Terms from Different Ideologies That Seem to Refer to the Spirit World. Right? The netherworld, the underworld, the astral and etheric planes, fifth dimensional space, locale 2, the psychosphere, the dreamtime, the noosphere, subspace, daemonic reality, space without time, the permanent autonomous zone, the imaginal realm, the collective unconscious, non-local consciousness, the fairy world, heaven/purgatory/hell.
He was abducted by aliens earlier this afternoon. That little girl got lost under the bed and she went into an alternate dimension.
This article is an interview with actor Yaphet Kotto, and it was posted to Vice.com on July 26, 2017 by Noel Ransom. Yaphet Kotto believes in aliens. The statement would be easy enough to take in on its own if not for the fact that Mr. Kotto also believes he's seen an alien, held an alien, and generally accepts that he's been abducted by aliens. Quote, "I never talked to anyone about it, man. This is the first time," Kotto tells me over the phone. "I've only told my wife, my rabbi, and a psychologist. This is the first time I'm talking about it. Understand that I felt special and disillusioned by this whole conversation. My initial goal was simple: speak with Kotto about his infamous death in Ridley Scott's 1979 masterpiece Alien for a story and submit. But buried at the bottom of my email exchange with his talent agent Ryan Goldhar were the words, 'He has also asked if you're open to discuss his UFO experiences in the Philippines.' I had to wonder what Goldhar was thinking to himself when he had to relay this information to me. This was an immensely talented, multi-award winning, Emmy-nominated icon. I can call him that because he paved the way for future African-American sci-fi roles in Alien, and he's been a Bond villain as Kananga in Live and Let Die, an exclusive privilege on its own. His actor credits list is 95 strong, so his reputation is intact. But despite all that, the showbiz legend wanted to speak about his lifelong association with aliens. While it would have been easy for me to dismiss the request as a strive for attention or simple delusion, the infinite examples of people claiming to have had been abducted by aliens are out there. Yes, the irony of a legend from Alien talking about real-life aliens sat with me, but I listened. Here are bits of that unfiltered, hour-long exchange that made me question whether Yaphet Kotto was telling me an amazing truth or something entirely imaginary. Vice, well, I guess we can get right down to it. I've been following you a while, and this is the first time in ages that I've seen you do an interview, and therefore heard about this alien stuff. Yaphet Kotto, well, I don't normally do interviews, as you already know. There have been 5 or 6 people who have tried to speak to me, and I've refused. But this is important to me. When my publicist said some journalist was willing to talk about this, it compelled me to come out with it. It has been 50 years of me dealing with these UFOs and aliens. Okay, so when did it officially start for you? It started when I was about 9 or 10 years old. I remember being told I couldn't go outside, so I was looking out at the streets of Bronx, New York, watching the kids play stickball in a kneeling position. When I turned around, a figure was behind me. It was at least 5 or 6 feet tall, with an elongated head. It appeared, then jumped to the back of me and disappeared. From that moment on, it was one experience after another which culminated into my sighting in the Philippines and during the filming of Alien. So you mentioned 50 years. This became a pattern for you? Yeah. At one point, I remember being at my home at 6 p.m., and I went into my office to meditate in the garage and saw something. Looked at it for about 5 minutes, and it was light. I was wondering why the neighbors were shining a light through the top of my garage window, so I went to talk to them. Now keep in mind I had been sitting in that car garage for some 12 hours, and I believe that I contributed to those things that were flying above my garage. I shouldn't call them things, these aircrafts. As I got older, I understood what they were, but I went through my youth not knowing what I was experiencing and didn't talk about it. I would just experience something and file it away until something larger happened. This is the thing other UFO witnesses don't talk about. Every time I moved into a house, above it at some point there would be a circle of what looked like smoke. I'd wonder where it came from because it sure as hell didn't look like clouds. Those sightings continued for a good 10 to 15 years, and I've had time loss. Where was I for the hours between when I saw some of these? Was I taken? Because I have a big loss of time between some of these moments. So what was this larger thing that happened? It was one evening in my office in the Philippines. I heard my wife and the waiters calling me to come outside in very anxious voices. So I went out, and when I got there, I saw the same huge circle of smoke over the house. When I asked them what they saw, they said they saw a UFO as big as the Yankee Stadium turned upside down, and they were freaking out. 2 or 3 nights later, I saw it. The thing blotted out the entire sky, the moon and everything. It was huge. I just remember saying, Jesus Christ, I got nervous, man. Because you don't see something like that without being vulnerable to becoming psychologically blown away. You get scared, to put it quite frankly. That messed me up for a good 3 to 4 days. Have you ever been diagnosed with any sort of mental health issue? Laughs. Absolutely not. I have an IQ of 196. Might as well say that hundreds of other people, including Canada's previous defense minister who came to the same conclusions about alien life, had mental issues as well. You know, people are probably going to read this, though, and think you're delusional or after something. What do you have to say to all that? There's no reason for me to make these claims. I never promoted any book or anything like that. I never read anyone talking about the experiences I've had. I've made 75 movies and I've done television shows. I'm known all over the world, so this confession wouldn't advance me. I advance myself through my acting. Other people may do this to try to advance themselves, make it public, and then become famous. I'm already famous, so what possible purpose would I have to tell these stories except how it relates to the movie Alien? This is the reason why I never talked about it after that movie, because of course they'd say, oh, he's trying to promote his movie. Well, I'm not promoting anything now. I've written no book and I have no movie that's about to be released. This is a time to reveal this because no one can connect it to anything that's a financial gain or form of media exposure. When someone now asks me if I ever experienced anything that's remotely close to an alien, I'll say, damn right I did. It happened at 9 years old and continued since then. So I really don't care whether anyone thinks I'm delusional. My delusion is over. I've taken a position on that. Seeing a UFO is so unlikely that many relegate sightings to hoaxes. Why do you think you've been made special in this? I don't know, but I'm getting to believe I'm special because I've seen those things many times. Not those things, I don't want to insult them. I mean, we've had them follow us around, showing up in places where I am. At one point, I was ready to run with my assistant in the morning around Manila in the Philippines. Got up, went outside, and we hadn't gone very far when one of those aircrafts showed up, and my assistant freaked out and said, look at that! And I said, yeah, and it kept moving. It followed us around, and she ended up telling all her friends. The next morning, we got ready to go out. I mentally sat down and began to disbelieve it and thought, if 2 show up, I'll believe. So we went out and sure enough, 2 of them showed up, and the next day it was 3 that showed up, as if by request. I always felt like I had a connection with them. It all related to seeing that alien at 9 years old when it jumped to the back of me because it was startled because I had caught it. I went to a psychiatrist to ask what the hell I saw, even a spirit healer who thought my family was into voodoo. For years after, I was scared to turn off the lights in the bedroom. On my mother's part, she even took me to a faith healer to say prayers and all this kind of stuff, and after that I never saw it again. So why would someone with such fearful ideas about aliens due to your experiences agree to act in a film about a pretty aggressive alien? Because my experiences had nothing to do with the movie Alien. It was the amazing script that was only 72 pages that brought me to that. Now, I'll admit, there were things that I alone was finding on the set of Alien, the spaceship, that mechanism that Sigourney Weaver throws to put the Sulaco, fictional spacecraft, on automatic destruct. There were symbols there, symbols that had nothing to do with the ship in the film, and I kept finding these symbols. They were like Egyptian symbols, and I started trying to decipher them, which I was able to do. Regardless of all that, the Alien script was one of the most well-written scripts in the history of scripts, and I've read a lot of them. It gave me an opportunity no other African-American actor had been given, and it opened doors for brothers to be in adventure space movies. Up until that time, they weren't in the business unless they were in churches or singing Amen. But regardless of great script, fear had to play a factor during your role as Dennis Parker in some way. Well, right after the chest bursting scene, I admit that I was not able to talk for about 2 or 3 days. When that thing came out of the chest, I was smoked. I started to wonder whether or not I should have found another profession or became a classical actor on a stage. I started to question my whole life. What kind of movie is this? This is weird. When we went into the room to shoot the scene, the whole atmosphere of the movie was gone because their crew was wearing white goggles and plastic masks to protect themselves. It was like walking into an operating room. They never warned us about the scene, so when we shot it and the damn thing came blasting out of the actor's chest, that freaked everyone out and sent us into a trauma. All of us. That simply brought me back to everything that I had experienced up until that point as it related to aliens and UFOs. I became a ufologist at that point. When you go through this thing with real-life aliens, you go through psychological changes. You begin to wonder whether or not you're being followed. So you really never once mentioned your experiences. It would seem like an ample place since the film was largely about an alien. I never talked to anyone about it, man. This is the first time. I've only told my wife, my rabbi, and a psychologist. This is the first time I'm talking about it, and I don't know why. I just decided I was going to do it this year. I've gotten to a place where I can no longer hold them privately. They aren't going to go away, and I honestly believe these species are close to making themselves known in this century to this generation. I believe their purpose is to make sure we don't kill ourselves. We're losing our rivers, lakes, mountains, and our caps are melting. We need to take a serious look at what we're doing, and they're going to help us do that. So, unlike the good aliens you speak of, you also looked genuinely scared during that death scene where you scream an alien. What were you drawing from then? I was just pissed off. When I did Blue Collar with Richard Pryor, on my black shirt is the spiritual eye. This circle with a large dot in the middle and a white star in the center of it. It represents the spiritual eye that Yogananda talked about that you can see if you're meditating and look upward. Now, I don't know why Ridley did this, but when that alien's mouth came open, it was headed right for my forearm, which is where the spiritual eye is supposed to be located. So when I saw the dummy version of my head with a craftsman where I said, why is this thing going towards the spiritual eye, man? The spot where our Indian brothers and sisters have their red dots. Well, that's where it was headed. Why couldn't it have gone into my chest or neck? That just pissed me off. So beyond your own real-life beliefs, do you believe anything else supports your sightings aside from your own mind? The former Canadian Defense Minister Paul Hellyer came out the other day and said America is playing around. He's got some videotapes out there talking about a number of species that come here, and he puts America down for not admitting the fact that aliens are a reality. That gave me a lot of comfort. Here was a man of importance that wouldn't make up stories or have anything to gain by what he was saying. So what do you want people to gain from this revelation? We're not alone. We're not alone in the universe. If you totally westernize the idea, look at it from a supremacy viewpoint, then you'll say everyone's imagining them when it comes to these things. We can say that, but much of the world would reject that premise. We're not alone.
Time has come to see the world as it is.
This is called A Skeptical Look at James Randi by Michael Prescott, and it was posted to skepticalinvestigations.org. Years ago, when I was a full-fledged skeptic, atheist, and rationalist, I read James Randi's 1980 book, Flim Flam! Psychics, ESP, Unicorns, and Other Delusions. Randi is an accomplished magician and a professional skeptic, dedicated to disproving any and all claims of what he considers pseudoscience. In line with this agenda, and as its title suggests, Flim Flam is a concerted attack on miscellaneous purported irrationalities, everything from the pop culture writings of Eric von Daniken to the more serious investigations of professional parapsychologists. I enjoyed the book, which reinforced my belief system at the time. Recently, I picked up Flim Flam again. Having changed my mind about many things over the past 20 years, I responded to it much differently this time. I was particularly struck by the book's hectoring, sarcastic tone. Randi pictures psychic researchers as medieval fools clapped in caps and bells, and likens the delivery of an announcement at a parapsychology conference to the birth of Rosemary's Baby. After debunking all manner of alleged frauds, he opens the book's epilogue with the words, "The tumbrils now stand empty, but ready for another trip to the square," a reference to the French Revolution in which carts, tumbrils, of victims were driven daily to the guillotine. Randi evidently pictures himself as the executioner who lowers the blade. In passing, 2 points might be made about this metaphor. The French Revolution was a product of quote-unquote scientific rationalism run amok, and most of its victims were innocent. Still, the tedious nastiness of Flim Flam does not tell us anything about its accuracy. Intrigued, I decided to check out a few of Randi's claims in detail. I chose to focus on Chapter 8, Randi's dissection of the experiments of Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff, two well-known parapsychologists. Randi calls them, quote, the Laurel and Hardy of Psi, and proceeds to argue that their experiments were a tissue of ineptitude, gullibility, and dishonesty. The first thing I noticed was that Randi never gives any indication that Targ and Puthoff have any scientific credentials or accomplishments. The casual reader could be forgiven for assuming that they are not real scientists at all. For the record, Targ is a physicist credited with inventing the FM laser, the high-power gas transport laser, and the tunable plasma oscillator. Puthoff, also a physicist, invented the tunable infrared laser and is widely known for his theoretical work on quantum vacuum states and the zero-point field. See The Field by Lynn McTaggart for an overview of Puthoff's work in quantum physics. If these two are Laurel and Hardy, at least they come with good resumes. Randi, by contrast, has no scientific training. Randi starts off by telling us how Targ and Puthoff took a professed psychic, Ingo Swann, to Stanford University, where they said Swann used his psychic abilities to affect the operation of a magnetometer. According to Randi, the report was all wet. He knows this because he contacted Dr. Arthur Hebert, quote, the builder of the device, who was present and has excellent recollections of what took place, end quote. Hebert, Randi says, disputes the Targ-Puthoff account. He is quoted as saying, it's a lie, you can say it any way you want, but that's what I call a lie. This is pretty compelling stuff, but is Randi's version of events accurate? Let's take a look. First, he seems to make a rather basic error when he says that both Targ and Puthoff were present for this experiment. As best I can determine, Puthoff conducted the experiment, which took place in June 1972 without Targ's assistance. Targ had met Puthoff prior to this time, but their work together apparently did not begin until a few months later. That's a small point. Far more important is the matter of Dr. Hebert's testimony. There's another side to the story, which I found in Chapter 17 of Psychic Breakthroughs Today by D. Scott Rogo. Rogo, who died in 1990 at the age of 40, was a prolific journalist and researcher of psychic phenomena. He wrote numerous popular books, some of which have been used as college texts. He also published research papers in peer-reviewed parapsychology journals. Although Rogo was sometimes criticized for tackling overly esoteric subjects, he had a reputation for honesty and was respected for his willingness to do hands-on investigation and fieldwork, rather than relying on armchair appraisals. Rogo writes, quote, there obviously exists several discrepancies between Dr. Puthoff's views on what happened during that experiment and what Randi claims Dr. Hebert told him. So to clarify the matter, I decided to get in touch with Dr. Hebert myself. I finally tracked him down at the Bell Telephone Laboratories in Murray Hill, New Jersey. He was very willing to discuss the Swann magnetometer demonstration with me, and professed to be very interested in parapsychology. End quote. Hebert's interest in the paranormal contradicts Randi's statement that Hebert, not being a reader of far-out literature, was unaware of Targ and Puthoff's claims. Rogo acknowledges that Hebert's account differs in some respects from Puthoff's. Quote, Dr. Hebert denied in no uncertain terms, however, Randi's claim that Swann never asked to stop the field charge being recorded from the magnetometer. He easily recalled that he had suggested that it would be a fascinating effect if Swann could produce it, which, of course, he actually did soon after the suggestion was made. Randi also directly quotes Dr. Hebert as calling some of Targ and Putov's claims lies. Dr. Hebert was very annoyed by this claim since, as he explained it to me, Randi had tried to get him to make this charge and he had refused. Dr. Hebert later signed a statement to this effect for me. End quote. As for the discrepancies between Hibert's and Putov's accounts, Roger reports that in a subsequent meeting with Putov, he was shown, quote, the actual graphed printouts given by the magnetometer during the swan demonstrations. The records supported Dr. Putov's contention more than they did Dr. Hibert's. So far, then, the best we can say is that Randi's criticism of Putov, and Targ, who apparently wasn't even involved in the magnetometer experiment, is far from the last word on the subject. Randi proceeds to launch a comprehensive critique of Targ and Putov's article, quote, Information Transmission Under Conditions of Sensory Shielding, end quote, which appeared in the October 18, 1974 issue of the respected journal Nature. The article details experiments involving, among other participants, the professed psychic Uri Geller. Randi's take on this series of experiments is withering. He skewers Targ and Putov as bunglers. He reports that their experiments were conducted in a chaotic atmosphere conducive to cheating. He says that a hole in the wall of Geller's isolation room enabled him to spy on the scientists during their ESP experiments. He says that Targ and Putov falsified the results of the test by omitting failed experiments that would have lowered Geller's averages to the level of chance. Further, he says that the scoring of Geller's performances was mishandled, generating higher scores than Geller deserved. The question naturally arises, how does Randi know all this since, as he admits, quote, I've never even set foot on the sacred grounds of SRI, Stanford Research Institute, where the experiments were conducted. He explains that he was given inside information by, quote-unquote, an individual who claimed to represent dozens of SRI scientists. This group, which worked in secret and even adopted a codename, Broomhilda, passed the information to Randi. Unfortunately, Randi never names this individual or any other members of the Broomhilda group. He says that, quote, Broomhilda verified for me much of the information that I had been holding onto for years, end quote. But where did he get this earlier information in the first place? That data, he says, now moved from the status of hearsay to documented fact. But documented is hardly a term applicable to either the initial information, which is never specified, or the Broomhilda information, which came from an anonymous source. He adds, quote, additional facts were elicited during conversations and correspondence with individuals. Many of those persons were not aware of Broomhilda and were acting on their own. The completely independent input supported Broomhilda's charges taken together. He concludes the information from all sources amounted to quite an indictment. Maybe so, but it's an indictment that would never hold up in court. The reader is expected to take Randi's word that his unidentified sources are trustworthy, and that the sources themselves are well informed about experimental procedures they may or may not have witnessed. Thus, when Randi alleges that, quote, hundreds of failed experiments that were done by SRI were never reported, end quote, we must take the statement on faith as it is unsupported by any documentation. Similarly, when Randi says definitively, quote, all the other tests, in other words the successful ones, lacked proper controls and were useless, end quote. We search in vain for any footnote to back up this assertion. A posting I found on the message board www.scicouncil.com sums up the situation nicely, quote, claims of poor scientific method leveled at the experimenters have been shown to be mainly unsubstantiated personal opinion and second-hand Chinese whispers. Chinese whispers is the British equivalent of the American game telephone. It might be worth adding that critics of paranormal phenomena like Randi are forever decrying any reliance on anecdotal evidence, which is precisely what the bulk of Randi's argument consists of. Randi does produce two individuals willing to go on the record, Charles Rebert and Leon Otis, both of whom are SRI psychologists. Rebert and Otis apparently disagreed with the Targ-Putov conclusions. Indeed, Randi tells us that, quote, a horrified Rebert also heard that Targ and Putov were going to proclaim these erroneous findings before Stanford University's psychology department, and he forbade such a blunder. The talk was canceled, end quote. But this only tells us that there was a dispute among scientists at SRI. Rebert and Otis ran some unsuccessful tests with Geller and decided that he was a fraud. Targ and Putov ran what they regarded as successful tests and decided that, in some areas at least, Geller had legitimate psychic powers. Nothing in Randi's text establishes which conclusion was correct. Randi goes on to report that after he had criticized Geller in an earlier book, Targ and Putov issued a fact sheet in rebuttal to 24 of his points. According to Randi, quote, this attempt was a failure, and in response to one claim that the SRI tests were done under tight controls, the scientist who was there declared flatly, this is BS. As far as my colleagues and I are concerned, none of the experiments met accepted scientific protocol. I will not burden you, Randi concludes, with the other 23 points. They are as easily demolished. Well, hold on. A quotation from yet another anonymous source, the scientist who was there, hardly constitutes a demolition job, especially when the scientist's argument consists of an unsupported assertion. Quote, none of the experiments met accepted scientific protocol, end quote. Personally, I would have welcomed the burden of the other 23 points and of Randi's detailed and carefully documented rebuttals. Some idea of the counter-arguments to Randi's claims can be obtained by taking another look at D. Scott Rogo, who earlier showed the initiative to track down Dr. Hebert. Unlike Randi, who, as we have seen, had never even set foot inside the research facility, Rogo visited SRI on June 12, 1981. He found that Randi had misrepresented the hole in the wall of the isolation room through which Geller was supposedly able to spy on the researchers. The hole, a conduit for cables, is depicted in Flim Flam as being 3.5 inches wide and therefore offering a good view of the experimental area where the researchers were working. Rogo found, however, that the hole is 3.25 inches wide and extends through a 12.5-inch wall. This scopes your vision and severely limits what you can see through it. The hole is not left open either, since it is covered by a plate through which cables are routinely run. Dr. Puthoff and his colleagues were, however, concerned that their subject might be ingenious enough to insert an optical probe through this hole, so they monitored the opening throughout their telepathy experiments. Randi also indicates that the hole is stationed 34 inches above the floor. Not so, says Rogo, quote, "It isn't 3 feet above the floor, but is located only a little above floor level. The only thing you can see through it, even under optimal conditions, is a small bit of exterior floor and opposing wall. The view radius is only about 20 inches, and the targets for the Geller experiments were hung on a different wall completely." I also discovered during my trip to SRI that an equipment rack was situated in front of the hole throughout the Geller work, which obstructed any view through it even further. I ended my little investigation by talking with 2 people who were present during these critical experiments. They both agreed that wires were running through the hole, therefore totally blocking it during the time of the Geller experiment. It would appear that the hole in the isolation boost wall poses considerably less of a problem than the holes in Randi's arguments. By now, I felt that Randi's credibility was in doubt. He had committed careless errors of fact, had quite possibly misrepresented and misquoted Hebert, and had made unsupported assertions based on rumors. I wondered what Targ and Puthoff have to say about all this. The only responses from either of them that I could find online were part of a long essay by Winston Wu, quote, "Debunking common skeptical arguments against paranormal and psychic phenomenon." The relevant part is argument 18. Puthoff is quoted as saying the following. Quote, "In Flim Flam, Randi gives something like 28 debunking points, if my memory serves me correctly. I had the opportunity to confront Randi at a Parapsychology Association conference with proof in hand, and in tape-recorded interaction he admitted he was wrong on all the points. He even said he would correct them for the upcoming paperback being published by the Psycop group. He did not. The truth of the matter is that none of Randi's claimed suspected inadequate controls actually had anything to do with his experiments, which of course Randi was not there to know of. This has been independently reported by Scott Rogo somewhere in the literature, who came out specifically to check each of Randi's guesses about inadequate controls and found them inapplicable under the conditions in which the tests were conducted. In fact, all of Randi's suggestions were amateurish compared to the sophisticated steps we took, suspecting as we did everything from magician's tricks to an Israeli intelligence scam. In case one thinks that it was just a case of our opinions versus his opinions, Puthoff continues, we chose for the list of incorrect points only those that could be independently verified. Examples, Randi said that in our Nature paper we verified Geller's metal bending. Go to the paper and you see that we said we were not able to obtain evidence for this. He said that a film of the Geller experiment made at SRI was by famed photographer Zev Pressman, was not made by him, but by us, and we just put his name on it. We showed up with an affidavit by Pressman saying that indeed he did make the film." End quote. There's no way for me to verify Puthoff's statement that he tape-recorded Randi's concession of defeat on all points. This has to stand as an unsupported assertion, just like Randi's own arguments, but it is possible to take a closer look at Puthoff's last 2 claims. First, Puthoff insists that his and Targ's Nature article does not endorse Geller's alleged metal bending. This is accurate, as you can see for yourself reading the article. Puthoff and Targ write, "It has been widely reported that Geller had demonstrated the ability to bend metal by paranormal means. Although metal bending by Geller has been observed in our laboratory, we have not been able to combine such observations with adequately controlled experiments to obtain data sufficient to support the paranormal hypothesis." End quote. On the other hand, I have not found any statements by Randi and Flim Flam to the effect that Targ and Puthoff, quote, had verified Geller's metal bending. He attacks the Targ-Puthoff experiments on other grounds. Of course, he may have made this statement elsewhere, but as far as I can tell, Puthoff is rebutting a point Randi never made. How about Puthoff's second claim regarding the SRI film? Randi certainly does make this an issue in Flim Flam. Targ and Puthoff, he writes, appended to the film without his knowledge or permission the name of Zev Pressman, the SRI photographer who had shot the film. Pressman, said Targ and Puthoff, was present during a particular series of experiments. Not so, according to Pressman. Most damning of all, Pressman said to others at SRI that he had been told the successful tests were done after he, Pressman, had gone home for the day. So it appears the film was a reenactment. Pressman did not even know that Targ and Puthoff were issuing a statement. He did not sign it, and he did not give them permission to use his name. He knew nothing about most of what happened or appeared under his name, and he disagreed with the part that he did not know about. Here we have Randi saying that this photographer Pressman was duped and used by the experimenters, while Puthoff says that Pressman signed an affidavit swearing that indeed he did make the film. Is there any way to resolve this? Further web search turned up chapter 14 of The Geller Effect. Part 1 of this book is written by Uri Geller. Part 2, which includes chapter 14, was written by Guy Leon Playfair. Living up to his name, Playfair offers an even-handed presentation of the various controversies surrounding the flamboyant and eccentric Geller. Playfair writes, quote, Randi turned in a later book, Flim Flam, to the professional photographer who had made the film, a Stanford employee named Zev Pressman, with an extraordinary series of unfounded allegations. Pressman flatly denied all of Randi's allegations in 2 public statements, neither of which was even mentioned in the 1982 reissue of the book. I made the film, said Pressman, and my name appeared with my full knowledge and permission. Nothing was restaged or specially created. I have never met, nor spoken to, nor corresponded with Randi. The quote-unquote revelations he attributes to me are pure fiction. End quote. It is true that no mention is made of these 2 public statements in Flim Flam's 1982 edition, the edition I own. For corroborating testimony, I turned once again to the indefatigable Scott Rogo, who investigated this claim just as he had looked into Dr. Hebert's testimony in the infamous Hole in the Wall. Rogo writes, quote, I spoke directly with Pressman on 5 January 1981, and he was quite interested when I told him about Randi's book. He denied that he had spoken to the magician. When I read him the section of Randi's book dealing with his alleged expose of the Targ Puthoff film, he became very vexed. He firmly backed up the authenticity of the film, told me how he had taken it on the spot, and labeled Randi's allegation as a total fabrication. His own descriptive language was a little more colorful. End quote. Rogo also reports that Puthoff showed him Pressman's signed affidavit. How could Randi's conversation with Pressman be so different from Rogo's? The truth is, Randi does not appear to have had a conversation with Pressman at all. Take another look at the quote from Flim Flam. The key words are, most damning of all, Pressman said to others at SRI. Evidently, then, Randi's source is not Pressman himself, but unnamed others at SRI, who passed on this information to Randi. Another round of Chinese whispers, it seems. At this point, Randi ends his discussion of the Geller experiments and proceeds to criticize Targ and Puthoff's later work, as well as the work of another researcher, Charles Tart. Dealing with these criticisms would require another essay of equal length to this one, so I will stop here. Before I began this modest online research project for a rainy afternoon, I had mixed feelings about Randi. I saw him as closed-minded and supercilious, but I also assumed he was sincere and, by his own lights, honest. Now, having explored his contribution to the Targ Puthoff controversy in some detail, I am thoroughly unimpressed. Randi comes across as a bullying figure, eager to attack and ridicule, willing to distort and even invent evidence. In short, the sort of person who will do anything to prevail in a debate, whether by fair means or foul. The title of his book thus takes on a new and unintended meaning. From what I can tell, James Randi really is the Flim Flam man. As an aside, I could recommend a book that clarifies a little bit more about James Randi. It's called Randi's Prize, What Skeptics Say About the Paranormal, Why They Are Wrong and Why It Matters. And it's written by Robert McLuhan. And it looks like it's gone up to $150 on Amazon, new and used. Ouch.
Science can explain everything if we look hard enough.
Shut up, science bitch.
Nothing is true. Everything is created. Not only is he like ruining my life, but with all this God shit that he's into, he could be ruining my afterlife.
It's a sort of interdimensional vagina that somehow appears. I can interact with it.
Fabric of the entire universe could be torn apart.
I know my mind is changing. I'm already too far gone to know what to do.